Hi, I'm Stanley Goldberg, host of the Inquiring Mind podcast. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. And if you're new here, I release 2 episodes a week with a variety of fascinating guests, and I would appreciate if you would support my podcast by liking this video and subscribing down below. Thank you for your support, and now to today's guest. John Sexton, welcome to the Inquiring Mind podcast.
Nice to be here.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure to have you on. Obviously, we got to chat a little bit before, and I mentioned that my brother went to NYU, and it's that I think he's looking forward to this interview a lot more than even myself. So,
Well, please say hello to him and
yeah, I
tell
definitely
him
will.
that he's carrying the NYU flag. He's got to make us proud.
Uh, well, I'll definitely pass that along. Well, again, thank you for coming on. I have your book from a couple of years ago. I think it's from 2018 or 17. I'm not exactly sure. It's called Standing for Reason. It's right here. It was really informative. I enjoyed it. I think it was concise. It wasn't overly long, and it was well written. You got your points across. So I think before we jump into that, um, I wanted to ask you about how you started the book. And in the opening chapter, you talk about the benefits of mentorship, maybe in an indirect way, but you talk about a man named Charlie Winans, if I'm pronouncing that correct.
Charlie Winans.
Winans, sorry. And the impact he had on you, and the quote he had, and I wrote it down so I don't mess it up. Whenever he talked about life, he had a metaphor that was a piano metaphor, which is play another octave of the piano. So if there's a food you haven't tried, try it. If there's a place you haven't been, go. And or a person you haven't met, try to meet them and get all the insight you can from that person. I That is probably the best explanation as to why I started this podcast. And I've always been curious, and this gives me an excuse to talk to some very interesting people and pick their brains. And look, here I am with you. So, how did Charlie shape your early life, and why did you dedicate the opening chapter of your book to him?
It's interesting because just today at lunch, just before I came over to start this with you, I was talking to a major educator, the man that runs the college board, and he brought Charlie up with me. And he said that since he had read the book, he'd been thinking an awful lot about the impact of teachers and how they can really shape the lives of the people they touch. This is my 61st year of teaching. I taught this morning a group of wonderful law students at NYU from all around the world, literally 30 students, probably from at least 15, probably as many as 20 different countries. And every time, right down to this morning, that I walk into the classroom, I think of Charlie. And I think about what a great gift he gave me when he was part of not only shaping me as a young person, I'll describe that to you in a moment. You can go into it as much as you want, but also in calling me to the vocation of teaching. I used to. I have a different word now because I've realized in a broader way the new word captures what I do in life better, and it includes teaching, of course. But I used to, whenever you went in and out of the country, you used to have to say your name and your profession, and I would always put down just teacher, no matter what title I was holding along the way. And during my 14 years as dean of NYU's law school and my 14 years as president of NYU, so during that full 28 years, even though it was the norm for most deans and most university presidents to give up their teaching, I not only continued to teach, but continued to teach a full faculty schedule, never less than 4 or 5 courses an academic year. And when people say to me, how can you do that? I would say I wouldn't know why I was doing the other things I was doing if I stopped being in the classroom, both at the law school and undergraduate with my students. It's what gives my life meaning. And that all traces back to Charlie. So I say there were two things he did. That he formed me and us, because I'm not the only one that would attribute this to him. And he, in the case of my own life, he called me to the vocation of teaching. So I just want you to picture him for a moment, because I don't think I go into this very much in the book, but I think I can tell from the smile on your face, you might derive some joy from this. So Charlie, even in his early 30s, looked like Colonel Sanders of Kentucky Fried Chicken. He had premature white hair. He had exactly that kind of beard. And he was like Colonel Sanders, a fairly large man. He also had an arresting voice. You could pick Charlie's voice out of a crowd of 1,000 at Madison Square Garden. He had this deep, one of the other faculty members at this glorious high school out in Brooklyn, where the Jesuits educated me, school called Brooklyn Prep, once said that Charlie had the body of Orson Welles. Now,
yeah,
folks may forget who Orson Welles is, but think Colonel Sanders, the voice of James Earl Jones, and the soul of St. Francis of Assisi. And that was Charlie. And he came to teach at Brooklyn Prep. He was not a Jesuit priest. He came to teach there after just finishing his PhD work at Columbia in English with some great teachers in the Columbia English department of the 1950s. And he arrived at Brooklyn Prep maybe 2 years before I did. So I got there in 55. I think he got there in 53. And he just occupied the place. I mean, he was a presence. And I don't know why or how the Jesuits did this, but they took 12 of us, and our schedule, you didn't choose your courses, our schedule from 8:30 to 9:30, 5 days a week for our sophomore, junior, and senior year was a course they just called Charlie. and I guess they didn't know what to do or how to cabin him or even what to name what he was going to do. But what it consisted of doing, in addition to great aphorisms like play another octave of the piano, and there were many of them. I mean, I remember the first day he walked into class, we had no idea what this course was. And he looked out at us. Remember, we're all boys. And he says, "Boys, on the first date, find out her IQ. Beauty fades, but the need for conversation never does." Now there you go, Stanley, podcaster. You see, conversation. That, you know, but the message he was giving us was so important to be given to boys who were just coming into puberty. You know? And with that, he started at the earliest stages of history, the cave paintings at Aldemara, and he went up through the centuries, teaching us simultaneously. Now, you got to remember, this was 1956. Nobody was using the words interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary at the time. And he went simultaneously teaching us history, literature, art, and music up through the centuries. From prehistory to the time we were seniors, we were listening to Aaron Copland and atonal music, and we were reading James Joyce, and we were looking at Salvatore Dali, and history, literature, and art, and music all together. And he always called us to something better. And I feel free to just give me a signal to cut me off if I'm going too long. But no. The one class I remember vividly, because today I can say to you that I have probably been to any of the places on your top 20 list, including the most remote, including both poles, including Papua New Guinea. And I've been there with my family, because one of the things Charlie taught us was, boys, no assets, just memories. That's a good life. Don't accumulate things. accumulate experiences. That's where that play another octave of the piano came from. Although he added, very importantly, as long as it's legal and moral, try it once. So he was even then saying to us, there are some things, I'm not giving you permission to just do anything. But anyway, I think it was in the end of our sophomore year, we had gotten up to we're doing Egypt and the old kingdom. And he had slides, and he's got slides on the side of the classroom, no screen, of the pyramids at Giza. And we had read the Book of the Dead, and we had read Shakespeare's play about Antony and Cleopatra, and we're listening to zither music. It's all going on all at once, right? And knowing that we were poor kids from the streets of Brooklyn and Queens, he said, pointing at the pyramids, boys, you will never see these pyramids in person because you can't drive to them. See, because he knew that we could only go to places we could drive. And then he added, now remember, this is 1956, 57. But boys, there are great pyramids south of here to which you can drive. Referring, of course, to Teotihuacan and Chichen Itza and Tulum. And he said, you just haven't heard of these pyramids because the goddamn British didn't rob these pyramids for their museums. So he was already back then talking about the provenance of art, the whole Elgin Marble problem, and who owns the antiquities. Well before, decades before it hit the scholarly literature and the legal literature and so forth. So that was Charlie, and he was an important part of my life till the day he died. In fact, Lisa and I, in a way, protected him or took care of him in the closing years of his life. I persuaded the Jesuits to make him the first non-Jesuit to move into their senior care facility up on the Fordham campus. And I had a driver that was kind of a regular driver. He was for one of these blacktop car companies, but my office would call and ask for Tippy. And I said to Tippy, who helped me drive Charlie up to the Fordham campus, and I said, Charlie, don't worry. Here's Tippy's phone number. And anytime you or any of the Jesuits want to get together, you just call Tippy, and Tippy will drive you over to the Bronx Zoo or the Botanical Gardens or down to Arthur Avenue, which up by Fordham is great Italian food, And I was out in Los Angeles for an NYU alumni event. And the head of the NYU emergency room, I'm president of the university at this point, head of the emergency room calls and says, we got a guy down here named Charlie who wants us to admit him. Now, Charlie was in a wheelchair at this point, and he was very frustrated with his rehabilitation. He knew NYU at the Rusk Center had the best rehabilitation in the world. So he called Tippy and said to Tippy, drive me down to the NYU hospital. And Tippy wheels him. You got to get the scene. Now, Tippy wheels him into the emergency room at NYU, and he shouts out, I am the ward of John Sexton. No, strike that. He first said, I am the ward of the president.
Oh, God.
And they thought that he was talking about Bush, but then he repeated it and said, I'm the ward of John Sexton. I am under his protection and I demand that I receive care. So they called me up, they searched me down and called me up in California and said, is this guy? I said, listen, do me a favor, please take good care of him. He's a national asset. I'll be back in a day. And I came back and I went to visit him in the hospital, and he was raving about the hospital food. They brought him his dinner. Now, this was a gourmand. This was a guy that I'm sorry, somebody cut in, but this was a guy who ate the best food in the world and the best restaurants in the world. And I'm there, and they bring him in his dinner, and it's fish. And he looks to me and he says, is this local fish? And I said, what do you mean local fish? He said, I'm worried about mercury poisoning. And I said, Charlie, they've given me a list of 12 things can kill you, and mercury poisoning is not on the list. You should just enjoy the fish. And that was the night he died.
Oh,
He died in the NYU hospital, happy, prayerful, and just Charlie. And when you have a teacher like that, if there's a gene in you that's called to teaching, I mean, he not only shaped my view of the world, but he called me to this wonderful vocation of teaching, which has now been 61 years of my life. I've never taken a semester off. I mean, I've been at a research university for 40 years. I've been at NYU for 40 years. And, you know, it's routine to take a sabbatical every 5 or 6 years. I've never taken one. And I couldn't imagine, I'm not required to teach now, but I teach a full schedule. I teach more than most of my colleagues. And that's all traceable directly back to Charlie. And it's the most joyful and fulfilling life a person could ever have. You know, and the new word I've come up with rather than teacher, because it encompasses things that are kind of offshoots, is I'm a possibilitarian. You know, the students that come to me as proteges, they know they don't have to take my advice as a condition of my continuing to be in their lives and put as much wind behind their sails as possible. I just want to put things on offer, which is the same thing that Lisa and I did with our children and now with our grandchildren. And it's in a way the same thing I did with NYU Law School and NYU as a university. And that I do in this book, frankly. I'm putting on offer a certain possibility and people will take it. And the worth of the idea is not what I can make happen with it, but whether or not people take it up and use it.
You mentioned there's so much to unpack in that beautifully put statement. When you teach, what is the thing about teaching that makes you not want to take a break? And obviously you just mentioned you have a sabbatical. You could take a sabbatical every 5 years or so. Everyone needs a break, right? Once in a while. Why do you feel like you don't?
Oh, I would never say. In fact, one of the great lessons of my life was taught to me by my son Jed at the end of my first year as dean of NYU Law School. And I finished my first year, and it was the first time that I had run a complex organization. So in addition to continuing my teaching, and I was doing some writing, here I was running the law school. And of course, that continued during the summer. And now it was September of 1989, and my 50th birthday was coming up. And Jed sat me down and he said to me, very insightful, he said, Dad, people like you who are called to the vocation of teaching were put on earth to live in secular time, the time of farmers, the time of Buddhism and Hinduism, not linear time. And what's happened is you've moved from a life in cyclical time to a life in linear time. And we, the family, are noticing you're exhausted because you didn't soil bank. So you said, take a break. Yeah. And he said, he knew I had a great love at that point for the Grand Canyon. And I had taken about a dozen trips out to the Grand Canyon, typically with students, first with my college roommates, but then after that with the high school students I was teaching. It would be a kind of capstone event for them. And we would always go down. I don't know. Have you been to the Grand Canyon?
No, not yet.
Okay, well, you must do this. How old are you?
24.
All right. Before you are 30, you must go to the Grand Canyon, but you cannot, I forbid you to go to the Grand Canyon and simply gaze down from the rim like a tourist. You have to give it a minimum of 3 days. And the one trail down from the southern rim, also from the northern rim, but most of the tourists go, most people go to the southern rim. That's where the classic viewpoints are. The one trail down is a trail that was carved out by Native Americans. It's called Bright Angel Trail. And Bright Angel Trail is about a 9-mile trail. So it's a 9-mile hike down, 9-mile hike out. And it's about a mile vertical drop or rise in the case of coming out. It's not an easy hike. It's not, although I've done it in those first 12 years when I was your age and a little bit older. I've done it down and back in the same day. Now I know how much that was a foolish thing and in a way life-threatening. So you want to go down, spend the night, come out. But I had gone down and out 12 times, but I'd never I'd seen the Colorado River, which you can't see from the top. And I touched the Colorado River and put my feet in the Colorado River. But I had never rafted the Colorado River and lived in the canyon for an extended period of time. So Jed said to me, Dad, from now on, in each June, you and I are going to take a minimum of a week, maybe as much as 10, 12 days. And we're going to go to someplace so remote in the world, you're completely incommunicado. And the first place we're going to do that is we're going to go into the Grand Canyon for 9 days and raft 150 miles of the river. And that started a family tradition so that every time somebody in the family reaches the age of 12, we all gather as a family and we bring some friends along, and a group of 20 of us go down into the canyon. And you're completely incommunicado. There's no communication, and you don't see any other people because there are only so many permits, and the people are either a half day ahead or behind you. So you really don't see them. And you do the river and you go off into side canyon hikes. And Jed and I started doing a different river each year until we got to the Charo River in Turkey, which is, we were good enough to do that, which is the World Championship course. It's a very technical river. But with the family, we've done the Grand Canyon now. Well, next year we'll do it for my 80th birthday. And there are 20 of us. We've already got the dates. We've had the permit for 3 years, and we're going to do 17 days in the river. And I made it very, very clear when I agreed to be NYU's dean, and then when I agreed to be NYU's president, that I was going to block out replenishment time, that being the most extreme example of it, but that we blocked on the family calendar time that was for me and Lisa and the kids and ultimately the grandkids and friends, that we would be incommunicado in some remote part of the world. And playing out octaves of the piano, right? That's what Charlie said, you know. So even though literally to this day, Lisa and I have never had a savings account and never owned any stocks other than the ones that are in my NYU pension fund that I haven't looked at since 1981. And she, when she was alive, she died 14 years ago, had a pension at the place she lived. So other than those stocks, which just happened in the fund and we didn't pay a lot of attention to, we've always been operating sort of a little above checking overdraft, you know, and I have this wonderful assistant that throws me a yellow card when we're getting too down. But we've invested both in people we believe in, so we give to charities as everyone should. Mostly our giving is for financial aid for students at NYU, and there are literally at this point probably, well, dozens at least of scholarships that we've endowed. But the other is in memories, and the memories translate for us into traveling to the most remote parts of the world. So with my grandchildren, I said, I'm not taking you to Europe because you'll get to Europe on your own. You're blessed with coming from a relatively privileged background. You'll have good educations, you'll get to Europe. But my granddaughters and I have been to Papua New Guinea and deep into the Amazon and so forth. So all of that's a variation on a theme, which you see comes back to what you stated, play another octave of the piano. The most important part of that, as you know from the book, is the part you said last. If there's a type of person you have not met before. Learn the world through that person's eyes. Learn yourself through that person's eyes.
Mm-hmm.
And the more radically different they are from you, the better. And that's on every dimension of difference, right? Ethnic, racial, viewpoint, social class, the works.
Do you feel like in some ways we've lost that ability? Especially I sense sometimes among younger people, the inability to talk to somebody that they disagree with on any given point. Again, it could be on the topic of race, it could be on the topic of religion or whatever, politics, but it's become so heated
Yeah.
whenever we talk to people. Do you think that, sorry to interrupt your thought, but do you think that that's a skill that we need to learn to get back?
Well, it's interesting because this again resonates with this lunch I came from with Dave Coleman, the head of the College Board, and the Dave and I. He's much younger than I am, but Dave and I both were grounded in the world of high school competitive debate. I at Brooklyn Prep, and then I worked for 15 years, starting, building, and nurturing a high school debating team, which was all young women at my sister's high school, which hasn't existed since the 70s, but was called St. Brendan's High School. He was at Stuyvesant High School, later, but also was formed and forged in competitive debate, where when we did it, you have the same topic for the whole year. And so, as I said to him today, if you're in a tournament in October, and the final round always was in the auditorium, and everybody that had been in the tournament, a couple hundred kids, would watch the final round between the two top teams. And if they were debating universal health care for all, and it was St. Brendan's against Stuyvesant, and of course, that was the best arguments that weekend. But if you came back 2 weeks later to another tournament and you had those arguments and nothing more, if you hadn't developed them, you were going to lose, because these are very bright kids that are doing competitive debate, and they're going to have gone out and researched the St. Brendan's arguments and the Stuyvesant arguments. Everybody's going to have those, and it's going to be who advanced to the next level. And then, of course, in each individual debate, there are 8 speeches, 4 by each side, and it can't be like these presidential debates where they're just exchanging talking points, right? So you have to, which is actually called in debate, quote, extend the argument, close quote, extend the argument, deepen the argument, take it to the next level. And of course, the greatest skill of a champion debater, people don't think of this. You could ask me, well, okay, tell me the 4 top skills of a champion debater. And they probably wouldn't list the one that's most important. And that is listening. Listening and understanding what your opponent said, because the judge is in the back of the room and he or she is listening and is marking it down as your opponent is saying it. And if you don't respond to what your opponent said, if you come in with some generic talking point, you're not going to win the debate, And then in the debate itself, you have to extend the argument. And of course, the greatest of all things that's structural about competitive debate in the context of your question, Stanley, is you don't know which side of the argument you're going to be on until the coin is flipped at the start of the round. You have to be prepared for the whole variety of arguments. So, he and I, he actually, by coincidence, had just finished reading Standing for Reason and wanted to talk to me about it. And it was very easy to talk to him about it because he came out of that world. Now, I think your diagnosis is spot on. In the book, I develop a language which is based upon a different part of my life, which is that for various reasons, I ended up starting my studies in 1963, which is important in this context. I know that all these years in the 60s and 70s blur for you, but the fact of the matter is that 1963 was in a way the end of the era ERA. I have a Brooklyn accent. I don't want you to think I'm saying ERROR.
Sorry, I'm from Brooklyn too, so.
Well, I know you are, but some of the listeners may not be. I think you have enough wattage to get to maybe even to Jersey, but but 1963 was in a way the end of the era of false innocence. You know, it's the year of the Kennedy assassination, a growing movement around race, around gender, around peace. In my church, the Catholic Church, it was the papacy of Pope John the 23rd and the Vatican Council. So I started getting my PhD in religion as a Catholic who had been formed in that era of false innocence in 1963. Now, I had been prepared by Charlie in a way and other great teachers at this high school in Brooklyn. But I think I tell this story in Standing for Reason. It's a story that's vivid in my mind. In 1956, in a classroom in Brooklyn, a man named Daniel Berrigan. Now, if you were to Google Daniel Berrigan, you'd find out that he had, I mean, no one's like Martin Luther King, but if there was a Martin Luther King of the peace movement, okay, Daniel Berrigan arguably would be that person. He and his brother Philip, you know, really led the anti-war movement. So this is not some regressive man. Yet, in 1956, in a classroom in Brooklyn, he wrote the words on the blackboard, extra ecclesiam nulla salus.
Yeah.
Outside the church, there's no salvation. And I went up to him after class and I said, Father Berrigan, he was a Jesuit priest. I said, Father Berrigan, does that mean that my best friend, Jerry Epstein, can't go to heaven? And Danny Berrigan said to me, John, if you don't baptize him, he won't go to heaven. That was the religious triumphalism of Irish Catholic Catholicism in Brooklyn. I mean, we had the one true faith, and that was the only way to get salvation. And by the way, the things that were really important, the truths with a capital T, they were not the product of critical reasoning. They came with, quote, the gift of faith, close quote. And they were explained to us by the Pope. And you didn't reason to those things. You knew those things because they had been, quote, revealed, close quote. Now, you take a 60-year arc from just before I wrote this book, okay, 1956 to 2016. Okay, in 2016, I was routinely participating in theological conferences with the representatives of a dozen different religions, and we were all benefiting in a positive sum game from listening to each other's ways of approaching the mystery of transcendence in life. Mm. So that arc, right? Now, meanwhile, and here's where we come back to your point. In 1956, my father was the head of the Jefferson Democratic Club in Brooklyn. He was the kingpin. He was the head of Brooklyn's Democratic Tammany Hall. But we had at our dinner table at the house people of all political stripes, all viewpoints. And it was all about how do we make things better for the people of Brooklyn? You know, how do we get the garbage picked up and the schools better and the housing better and better work and so forth and so on. But now, 60 years later, our politics are like religion was back then. It's the arc has gone in the opposite direction. Back then, I used the phrase secular ecumenism, because ecumenism is the word theologians use to describe the embrace of other faiths as revealing to you. Back then, there was political, secular ecumenism. Today, we have secular dogmatism. And the role of the Pope is being played by Tucker Carlson or Rachel Maddow or whatever. And people are in various flocks. That's what they used to call the members of the church, the flock, right? With the good shepherd showing them. And people are in various flocks. And there is no more reason in the process than I would have reasoned about the virgin birth or the resurrection of Christ. It was just revealed. So you get your revelation, and it's an impregnable revelation. The revealing number to me, which I in my research for the book I found, was in 1956, 3%. That's the number after 2 and before 4. 3% of Americans told pollsters they would be upset if somebody in their family married somebody from the other political party. Today, that number is over 40%. More than race, more than religion, more than ethnicity. Now think about that. Back in 56, if I, as an Irish Catholic, had married an Italian Catholic, it would have been more offensive to my family than if I, as a Democrat, married a Republican. Think about that. So yes, this huge chasm has developed. And I'm very happy to see that there's now literature that's developed. I'm a little disappointed they don't cite back to my phrase, secular dogmatism and secular ecumenism. But there have been columns recently by people like David Brooks and about research coming out of Michigan, very good research, which refers to what's called sectarian politics. And it's now au courant to talk about how politics has become like religion. And of course, I note that in the first part of my argument in the book. But what I haven't seen yet is the hope we should get that we can get by this. We can get by this, because if we got by it from the triumphalist Irish Catholic Church of the 50s to today with theological ecumenism, we can have secular ecumenism. And that's where I argue universities can really play a role. And the interesting thing is there are techniques that we used around aggressive listening, around what the great theologian who influenced Pope Francis, Raimundo Panikkar, called dialogic dialogue, where you really try to put yourself in the space of the other person. We're not talking tolerance here. We're talking we're talking Charlie. We're talking the genuine embrace of difference, playing another octave and all the great music that can come from that.
Yeah, I think when listening to that point, I was writing down ideas that were coming to my mind, and I'm gonna try to connect all of them into one overarching thought. So I went to Baruch College, which is a CUNY, not too far from NYU. So
did you have Doug Musio there by any chance? Professor of political science?
No, I don't think I did.
He's very popular, and he has a TV show that you should check on YouTube, Doug Musio, Muzzeo, because he has years of it doing the kind of thing you're talking about. Sorry to interrupt.
No problem. I'll definitely check it out. I had a professor. I was lucky enough to have a professor my freshman year named John Robertson, who taught at Columbia as well. He was a social worker for decades. And one of the greatest parts about that class that still stick with me are the debates we used to have. So once a week, I think the class was twice a week, and we would have he would have a randomizer on the board, and you would just be put into random groups and have to represent random arguments. So one day, I was on a team that had to, abolish Social Security, which is an idea I never thought I would hold, but I had to research it, and I had to go into the shoes of somebody that believes something like that. And I think it made me a better learner, better listener, and a better person for taking a class with a person like that. What I was disappointed to see is that there are not more teachers like that. And like Charlie, you described, somebody that maybe takes you a little bit out of your comfort zone and challenges your preconceived ideas and thoughts. what you were mentioning earlier, that universities play a major role in the role of free speech and open ideas. I, I've been concerned for a while now, where I've seen people that are quote unquote controversial figures, authors like uh, Charles Murray and uh, Ben Shapiro. These are more conservatives, but then even like a guy like Bill Maher on TV, who gets shut down from a place like Berkeley. And it's concerning to me that, yes, these people might be conservative or liberal, it doesn't matter. They might have some unpopular opinions, but it's the I think Bill Maher actually has a perfect line: sunlight is the best disinfectant. If you believe that somebody has bad ideas, go ask them a question, combat it with good ideas, and ask them, and try to maybe poke holes in their argument. They come up better and you come out better for it. And the last point I kind of wanted to make, again, I'm sorry if I'm going on a little too long,
No, it's fine.
but the interesting thing in your book that I saw was towards the end, you described your wife, Lisa, who sadly passed away, you mentioned 14 years ago. Um, and Charlie gave the advice that, find a person that challenges you, and maybe because otherwise, beauty fades, but that's the one thing that will maintain. I took that to heart. And whenever I listen to people that in some ways inspire me, or I can learn from, I heard President Obama on a podcast recently where he was talking about the same thing with Michelle Obama, where she challenges him all the time. And that's a good thing. My girlfriend of close to 5 years, challenges me all the time as well. And I think otherwise frankly, I'd be a little bored, because I don't want people to agree with me all the time. It's not how we grow, and that's not how we develop. So um, I think, to ask a question, how can universities better accommodate maybe unpopular opinions and allow these people to have a platform to speak without, being shut down or anything like that?
It's very interesting to me how certain axioms have infiltrated the kind of conversation we're having. And in particular, conversations in which I partake a great deal, which is conversations about higher education. And although they may have a kind of basis in specific examples, they get articulated as axioms that are generic descriptions of the system. And I don't want you to take this personally, because I've heard these axioms come out of the mouths of extremely well-informed leaders. There's a whole conversation which I think is probably beside the point for our discussion today, and I think it's fine that it is. But just to give a vivid example, I spent a lot of time in the book disaggregating a statement I first heard from President Bill Clinton after he was president, in a conversation at the Clinton Global Initiative. And it had to do with the cost of higher education and how it was skyrocketing and how it was creating a problem of student debt and so forth and so on. When one gets into the data, that problem looks very, very different than in the axiomatic statements that have come to dominate the discussion about that. And the result of that is that you can end up with policy solutions being proposed that actually cause harm rather than do good, that are regressive rather than progressive. So why do I make that analogy here? There are instances, you've given two with Murray and Maher. There are instances of the silencing of viewpoints on campus. There are problems even with a more subtle, what I'll call disciplinary capture of departments where within a discipline, there might be very different ways of approaching a topic, but one particular current of the discipline captures the department, which is a more subtle variation on silencing certain viewpoints. And it may not be as, it may be more, to use a phrase that's used in other contexts, structural than intentional, but it sure ends up limiting the liveliness of the debate and the ideas within, let's say, the economics department of research university X, if everyone is rational choice theory, for example.
Yeah.
So yes, that kind of thing goes on. But although I would not give universities writ large an A+ or even an A, and maybe not in many cases even an A- in terms of welcoming a diversity of viewpoint on campus, I would give higher education in the United States at the very least a strong B+, and maybe even a weak A- for welcoming that. Now, why do I say that in the face of this axiom that's out there, that this silencing is occurring? Because, and this is where I give data in the book that is, would probably be very surprising to people. I mean, the latest polling as of the book, I haven't followed it since, but I would assume it's about the same. It was the same for roughly 20 years, is that professors who self-describe with as having conservative viewpoints find themselves more happy and content on campuses than do those who self-describe as liberal, by a fairly significant differential. 66% of conservatives say they're happy, 56% of liberals say they're happy. And when people self-describe their political viewpoint, with data going back all the way to 1984, the number of professors on campuses who self-describe as liberal has remained relatively constant. There has been a diminution of the number that self-describe as conservative, but the growth has occurred in those that self-describe as moderate. And when you get into the silencing conversation, okay, there's an organization called FIRE, which monitors this question of silencing. And the latest data comes from about 3 years ago, because there's a little bit of lag in the reporting. And in 2017, in all of American higher education, they were only able to find 35 cases, which was down from 45 the year before. So it was a diminishing rather than growing. And 98% of university presidents that were polled said that they viewed diversity of viewpoint on their campuses as being an extremely important issue to which they paid a great deal of attention. So this is like a little counterintuitive from the axiom that is built up around this conversation of ideological capture, and this. And I can tell you that I had a 14-year hiatus in going to faculty meetings as a faculty member, but in 2016 I returned to the law school's faculty. Now, the NYU Law School faculty is, this may not be known to you or your listeners, but the NYU Law School faculty, I think for the last 3 or 4 years at least, has been the most widely cited law faculty in the world by judges and scholars. I mean, it's right up there. If it's not the top faculty in the world, as good as any. Diversity of viewpoint is broader than the diversity of viewpoint of the Supreme Court of the United States. There are strong, intelligent spokesmen across the board, and to sit in the faculty workshops each week, where a piece of scholarship's been discussed for 2 hours by the faculty as it's working through, what we do is we read each other's work, or to sit in the faculty meetings, that's an A+. That's an A+. Other parts of NYU, I would not give an A+ to. NYU as a whole, I'd like to think that NYU as a whole is somewhere, above the median for sure, and maybe in the top quintile among universities. But I think that universities now. I spend a whole section of my argument, 1/4 of my argument is around how one would address this in very specific context. But we don't have time to go into all that today. But you know, you've read the book. I spent a lot of time on this, and you know, as president of the university, in terms of speakers on campus, the first test I got was when a major donor. I'm talking a 9-figure donor. Not the $10 donor, a 9-figure donor called me, and I actually hadn't been publicly named president yet. This was in 2001. I was still at the law school, and told me that that person was going to withdraw that person's gifts to the university and renege on the pledges if I allowed President Bill Clinton to come on campus. Now, so the pressure didn't come from the left in that instance, and you know, and I did what you'd expect me to do. I said, "Well, I'm very sorry that we're going to lose your gift, but you can't buy NYU." And I said the same thing to the left when they wanted me to ban a person who had been invited by a group on campus. I would not have invited him myself, but had been invited by a group on campus, and that was the so-called Cuban Minister of Justice. And that set off a whole different, you know, pressure to ban that person. But we set up. I mean, my in those days there were things called fax machines, and my fax machine didn't stop running for 4 days before that Cuban Minister of Justice showed up on campus. But we set up rules that however long he spoke, he would submit to questioning for twice as long, that he would be in a room where there would be 24 students, and we gave first priority to students of Cuban descent. And the Florida congressman that had vilified me in the lead up wrote a letter and said publicly afterwards that the event represented the kind of confrontation should have occurred. So, you know, this is the job of leaders. And sometimes it's not easy, but I think that American higher education does pretty well.
Yeah, one of the other things, maybe I'm not trying to push back too much, but
push back as much as you want, man. It would not be in the spirit of the conversation if you didn't push back.
But I've had a lot of friends that went to different universities, some private, some public, doesn't matter much, but they don't have to be described, you know, conservatives or liberals or whatever. If sometimes they feel like they have an idea in their head that they want to share with the class, but they sense automatically that it would be unpopular to bring it up, or they would catch a lot of heat for bringing it up sometimes from the professor themselves. You know, that there have been cases, I'm not, you know, it's not maybe backed up by data, but sometimes teachers are guilty of lowering people's grades for having certain ideas. But this self-censorship that younger people have to go through when they're on a college campus is more concerning to me than not letting, you know, a person on a campus.
Right. Well, I was responding to the example.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
But I applaud your pushing back, and I accept your description. I know. I mean, I'm very, very connected to students. I'm known. You know, at the law school, I knew virtually every student's first name. At the university, of course, I couldn't do that. But in places like NYU Abu Dhabi, where as long as I was president, I was deeply involved in teaching there, and I knew every student's first name, and certainly all of my own students. And they tend to stay with me. So there is truth to what you're saying, and there is self-censorship that goes on. The first thing that I would say, though, is that this is something our society is working through generally. So it's something that is occurring to all of us in all of our conversations. And in some ways, that's been a good thing. Now, I just had an example just before, as I was coming literally into my apartment back from lunch with Dave, and the doorman, who's a wonderful man, and is from what would be called in academic circles an underrepresented group. And he said to me, you know, when you were walking out before, when I had gone out earlier to go over for lunch, when you were walking out before, I called after you because I wanted you to see, he meant be warned, but I didn't understand. He said see. And then he used the name of a bird, a rare bird, that's sometimes used as a pejorative for people who have mental illness. And I'm not repeating that name here because it's not something that I would have used to describe a person with a disability. And in fact, when I responded to him, I said, gee, is that the first time there's been a sighting in Washington Square Park? Because he said in Washington Square. And I actually thought he was, speaking about the bird, that there'd been a bird sighting. And then he began to describe the behavior of the people involved. And he said, I just wanted to warn you. Well, I understand the utter and complete innocence of why. I mean, there's no culpability in him. There would be culpability in me if I didn't engage in some self-censorship. Now, this is a very fine line, I accept. Okay, I'm not saying this is an answer to you. And I don't think self-censorship is a good idea, but thinking about the impact of what you're going to be saying on others, intentionally or unintentionally, that is a good idea. And that's part of communication. I used to tell my debaters, because they would say, wait a minute, that look on our flow chart. We made this argument. The judge didn't hear it. It's not the judge's duty to hear. You are to cause him or her to hear. If you're arguing a case before the Supreme Court of the United States, you've got to know where each of those justices is. And if there are 4 of them who are are going to accept your argument, and 3 aren't, and the other 2 are going to decide the case, every word, every syllable you use, how you stand, everything you do, how you write your brief, should be in terms of how you get those 2 people to understand, given where they are and have been, and other opinions and so forth. This is good teaching. Every good teacher takes this into account. I mean, I have the thrill of teaching probably the most diverse portfolio of students ever, because I teach not only in New York and not only at the law school. The class I'm teaching now, as I think I said earlier, is all foreign lawyers from 20 different countries. But when I teach in Abu Dhabi, my class is usually limited to 20, and typically they're from 18 different countries and 4 different continents, maybe 5, sometimes 6 continents. We rarely get anybody from Antarctica, but in any case, and then I go from there to China to teach at NYU Shanghai. That requires an almost ecstatic, in a sense of standing outside of myself, not in the sense of extreme joy, but an ecstatic experience of trying to. If I say in NYU Abu Dhabi, the revolution, I might have a student who, in fact, one year I did have a student who lost 9 family members within the previous 5 years in the Rwandan revolution. He's not thinking of the American Revolution. And I've got to be aware of that. When I talk about an established church, I got to be aware of the fact that many of the students. So all of this is of a piece for me. I hope you see the way it fits together. But as we self-censor, we should make sure we're self-censoring for the right reason. And sometimes, if you do a careful judgment and you say, okay, now, am I silencing myself simply because I don't want to be the one person here that voted this way on that? Well, to me, that's the censorer's problem. You see, we're in a time where people don't want to take any pain. But if you really believe it, you'll sharpen your viewpoints much better. If you and you're not going to get a conversation going if you don't make it possible. And maybe that means, especially if you're a person coming from relative privilege, maybe that means, and by the way, whether your views are liberal or conservative doesn't track that necessarily. I mean, the censorship you're talking about probably occurs among kids that are very privileged. They got very little at stake, really. Well, what it be? Sticks and stones will break my bones. So we never have that. So get it out there and debate it, and either win a good conversation or at least in a very calm and quiet way, make the point that conversation's not occurring, that people are acting out of secular dogmatism, out of a revelation from, in this hypothetical you've given me, from Rachel Maddow.
Maybe to pivot a little bit, because I'd be remiss if I didn't ask a few questions that I've had top of mind since confirming you as a guest.
Well, we don't want to disappoint your brother, so.
So what is I know you're not the president of NYU anymore, right? Correct. And what was the day-to-day life of a major college president like, and what do you think would surprise people the most about what it takes to run a university of that scale?
Well, the first thing that folks should understand about universities and colleges in general, and I spend a lot of time, since everything I do outside of NYU, I do pro bono. I get invited to do things a lot because my fee is the same, the same fee that I'm getting from you, which is zero. But the result of that is I get to be in a lot of interesting conversations, and a lot of them are with people that are running universities or schools that ask me to come in to advise them on things like that. And when I talk to the trustees of various universities, the first thing I say to them is, a university is not a command and control environment. So if you're the CEO, the president of a major university, like NYU is the major, other than the government, it's the largest employer in New York City. People don't realize that, okay? It's got 280 buildings. It serves millions of meals a year. It provides healthcare for millions of people. It provides housing for 3,000 faculty members and tens of thousands of students. It's on 6 continents. I mean, it's a big operation. Its annual operating budget at this point, I'm not certain on this, one of the things you have to understand is when I leave, I move on. So I'm aggressively uninformed about NYU. I'm informed about the law school because I'm a faculty member there. I go to faculty meetings, although I never talk. I just vote for whatever the dean wants. I don't even have to think whether I agree with it or not. Whatever the dean deserves one vote from the faculty at least. Now we have a great dean; he gets unanimous votes most of the time. But in any case, coming back to your point, the complexity of the university with, I would guess, the NYU operating budget this year, it's about $14 billion. It's big, right?
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is, as CEO, very, very few people think they're working for you. You do not have command and control. So what I say to boards of trustees is, the consummate command and control is the military, obviously, right? And then if you come along a spectrum, let's say you start, and that's the letter A, somewhere around the letter D or E would be a privately held business where everybody essentially works for the guy that owns the business.
Yeah. And
then you proceed along, and maybe somewhere around L, you get a publicly held business with shareholders and so forth. And then somewhere around M or N or O or P, you'd get, a small nonprofit. Okay, so if we ended with P there, universities would be past Z through another alphabet and probably Z of the third alphabet in terms of command and control. The very, very best people in a university are your star faculty. They all have lifetime job security and tenure. They cannot be fired, no matter what they do or say. They can walk up to the president of the university in the street and say, I hate you. Done. Done. Or you have.
That hasn't happened to you, has it?
uh, it's happened to
Oh, wow.
me, but fewer than 5 times.
Okay.
But in any case, you just you say fine.
Yeah.
You don't get in a fight over it. You just accept it. And here's another really important thing that comes as a piece of wisdom from my son Jed. Again, I don't want to give short shrift to Katie, my daughter, but it happens this one comes from Jed as well. My first year as dean of NYU's law school, the Tisches had just bought the football giants, and they invited the new dean of the law school, because they wanted to know who I was, and my spouse, Lisa, to come to a football game in the owner's box. And Lisa didn't want to go. She didn't go to NYU stuff. So I asked if Jed could go. He was at the time 19. And they said, of course. So we go over. We want to watch the football game. We're football fans. But, we also socialized a little bit. And at halftime, people came in to pay homage to Mr. Tisch. And the 15 or so of us in the box were there, including Barbara Streisand and Dan Rather, who was then did the CBS News, the Tish's own CBS. And so on the way home in the car, Jed says to me, Dad, you're a comma person, C-O-M-M-A, for those that don't understand Brooklyn, comma person. And I said, did you make that up? And he said, yeah, I did, I think. I said, what does it mean? And he said, well, didn't you notice at halftime when people came in to pay homage to Mr. Tisch, he would say to them, oh, Barbara Streisand, Dan Rather, John Sexton, comma, the dean of NYU Law School. He said, your presence had to be explained. Why? Stanley, it was very useful. Because if you are the president of the university, you are yourself, which is the left-hand side of the comma, and you're loved by Lisa and Jed and Katie and your grandchildren, and you have your friends. But then you're also the right-hand side of the comma. And because you're the right-hand side of the comma, in this case, the dean of NYU Law School, you get places you wouldn't get as John from Brooklyn. And you can't let it go to your head.
Yeah.
You can't make it, and you'll also get vilification that has nothing to do with you.
Yeah.
It's because you are the one whose picture has to go on with the circle and the X through it, because you are the representative of that. You're the iconic symbol of that. So, when faculty members, I don't think anybody ever said, I hate you, no matter how they put it. One actually went on beyond that and said once in a conversation, small group, I hate the way you look. I hate the way you smell. I hate your wife's name. I hate went down a list to try to say this is personal. And I just said, I'm very sorry you feel that way. It must be that I haven't been able to show my better self to you. I'll try. Because what are you going to do?
Yeah.
You're going to only try, and you're going to hope. And of course, this gets back to talking about conversation as well. If you take offense and say, how dare you say that? So, but if you show a different side, the hope is in the gift we all have, which is a mind, that maybe you'll set a spark. Right. So leadership in a university, and maybe this answers both my experience of it and your question about which way, is essentially evocative leadership. You tell a story of possibility. This is why I said, when I really tried to wrap up all the things I've done, I'm a possibilitarian. So you tell a story of NYU that's connected to New York City, based upon listening carefully. What is NYU? What is New York City? Whoa, wait a minute. New York City is the first city in the world that has a neighborhood for every country in the world, populated by people born in that country. 40% of the students of 40% of the citizens of New York City were born outside the United States. Wait a minute. If you go into you could visit every country in the world by going into the neighborhoods, and you could taste their food and hear their music and their language, and Charlie's play another octave of the piano, and just by getting on the subway. And now, wait a minute. All this time we felt bad because of the place where your brother went to be claustrophobic behind gates for his MBA. You know, NYU felt such an inferiority complex to Columbia's beautiful gated community up there.
Yeah.
But we are in and of this ecumenical city of difference, and embrace it. And who would want gates between yourself and other human beings? And suddenly the view of an ecumenical university emerges, you see? Mm-hmm. A view of a university that celebrates complexity, not simplicity, and not one side of the fence and the other, you know. But because when you go into those neighborhoods, is New York City perfect? Certainly not. Okay, but when you go into those neighborhoods and you say to those people, "What are you?" It may be little Lithuania or little Ireland or little Italy, but they say, "I'm a New Yorker." And it's an Uber and a whole, and that is Teilhard de Chardin and John the 23rd view of an ecumenical world. So now you say, "Ooh, that's something." And the Global Network University with campuses on 6 continents is just a natural extrapolation of those neighborhoods. But could I order that? No, of course I couldn't order it. I had to tell a story of that possibility and see if the community would accept it, not by plebiscite, but a sufficient number of people to make it work. And here we are, 20 years later, and who came to succeed? A Schlemiel from Brooklyn, who stepped down and, holy cow, the head of Oxford, who before that was the provost of Yale. And he comes in, he said, and why is he coming? Because he sees the Global Network University as the most innovative story of a university anywhere. And people can say, as Stephen Holmes, the great political scientist, said, that the great universities of the world, the Oxfords, the Beidahs, and so on, were built to train the leadership group of the nation. But the Global Network University is the first university that's built to create the leadership of the world, and a united world where we all listen to each other and rejoice in difference. And that's basically Charlie's idea.
Yeah. That part about New York, and I wish I could frame that and put it into like a video frame, and an ode to New York. It was beautiful. To begin wrapping up, obviously I can talk to you for hours. I don't have that privilege, but I end all my podcasts by asking 2 questions. I'm going to put them together, and then you answer them in whatever order you please. The first one is, what gives you hope for the future? It could be as general or specific as you want. And the second question is, what are 5 books on any topic, fiction, nonfiction, that you would recommend to people?
Well, they are actually connected now that I think of it. Look, my hope as a possibilitarian comes from the extraordinary talent and dedication to healing I think we have to say at this point, healing our country and the world, that I see in my students and colleagues every day. I mean, I spend hours, I mean, 15, 20, 30 hours a week just in conversation outside of classroom with my students. And they all have that sparkle that you have in your eyes. You know, when I see you caring about ideas and genuine ecumenical dialogue in a secular sense, it makes a difference to me. When I see the reaction of students, some of whom, when they began the course, know nothing about baseball or nothing about religion or both. But the theme of my Baseball as a Road to God course is essentially touch the deepness of your humanity and love, and beware of defiling that wonderful experience of love and transcendence that we all can hear. Maybe when we visit the Grand Canyon before we're 30, because this old man said you must do it and you must go down Bright Angel Trail. Touch that transcendence, and then don't defile it by locking the ineffable, that which can't be put into words, like love, by reducing it to a syllogism. I mean, there's a place for the mind and there's a place for the spirit.
Yeah.
And I see that in my students, and I see, you know, and you referred to the chapter, the last segment of the book. It's really a conclusion, which is called Being Worthy of Lisa, as I represent her in this world, as well as myself, and represent our love incarnate. She taught me that if we don't believe, if we're not, and this connects to the books I'll give you, if we're not a bit quixotic, we're not willing to tilt windmills, to I don't want to say, and I won't say dream the impossible dream, because that gets us to the song from La Mancha, but you know, if I had been very pragmatic about most of the things that happened at NYU Law School or NYU as a university, where I didn't do them, but people responded to the story of the possibility that they could be done, right? And they planted the seeds along with me, and then they tilled them, and then I left because I wasn't the cause, but they continued, and the university now broadly continues to water. They built some roads over some of the stuff, and they built some new bushes over there, you know, but that's hello. Anyway, I get a lot of encouragement and optimism just from interacting with the students. Now, you said 5 books, so I'm going to embarrass, I'll probably get excoriated by my children and grandchildren, because they say, you know, Dad, you know. Now you have to understand that I'm Catholic, and the church and its liturgy mean a lot to me. Lisa was Jewish, and our entire family is Jewish. So the children, the grandchildren, everybody is Jewish. So we're an ecumenical family, and they say to me all the time, "You're such a Catholic," you know. And they will say this about the first 2, at least, of my books, but they're very much in the theme that. So one I have to do, which I'm virtually certain that you haven't read, and that none of your listeners has read, and you'll probably think less of me when you do, because it's very Catholic, as Lisa said when she finally was able to read it. And I said, of course it is, you know, but you have to put that beside, you know. I'm not trying to convert you. It's called Mr. Blue, and it was the first book that Charlie assigned to us. So I read it for the first time when I was 12, and it was taught to me by Charlie. It's by a man named Miles Connolly. Now, my son said, Dad, if you're going to mention Mr. Blue at all, because I try to insinuate it into conversations. He said, be sure that people know what you later found out and are able to tell us, which is that Mr. Blue and Miles Conley were the inspiration for Frank Capra's movie, It's a Wonderful Life, which everybody has been to. So it's very much in that genre. It was written in the 20s, and Mr. Blue is a character that I try to emulate. Essentially, no assets, just memories. Live the spiritual life. And then, since I'm in that vein, and this is the other one where I'll probably get in danger for being too lowbrow, but one of my favorite authors, it won't surprise you or people that know his writing, is Graham Greene. Mm-hmm. And, you know, the easy book to recommend by Graham Greene would be something like The Power and the Glory and so forth. But I'm not recommending The Power and the Glory. You've limited me to 5 here, so I have to be careful. I'm going to recommend a book that very few people that read Greene read, which is called Monsignor Quixote. And it's about a little parish priest in Spain who thinks he's descended from Don Quixote. So it's kind of another Mr. Blue, but by a more fancy writer. 5 books. You know, one thing's hitting another here. So I'm going to recommend C.S. Lewis's book, A Grief Observed, which is his examination of how love survives the death of his wife. It meant a lot to me when Lisa died. He knew that his wife, they knew she was dying when they got married. They were both Dons. And so I tell my students to read it not as a book about grief, but a book about love. Okay, so now that stimulated me to a great book about love. So a dear, dear friend of mine who's been on the bestseller list of the New York Times 5 times, once for a piece of nonfiction called Constantine's Sword, which is the history of Catholic anti-Semitism. Mm-hmm. A must read, but not one of my 5. I'm not using up one of my slots. Trying to think out loud here. I'm not going to pick one of the ones that made the bestseller list. I'm going to pick his most recent novel. It's called The Cloisters. The Cloisters, and his name is James Carroll. He's a spectacular writer, spectacular man. And The Cloisters is set up in Fort Tryon Park. And it somehow involves Eloise and Abelard, the great medieval lovers who were excommunicated. So it's a great, I wept in the final pages thinking of Lisa. The book so exudes love. So I did a friend in James Carroll. I got to do, first of all, you know, the president of Research University, so I've got to do nonfiction, otherwise you won't take me seriously. And so one of the smartest people I know is my dear friend James Traub, T-R-A-U-B.
Yeah. John Quincy Adams. He wrote a book about John Quincy Adams, correct?
Very good. You know, I'm going to tell him that you knew that. He loves JQA. He's just finished a book, by the way, on Judah Benjamin, which is going to come out in the fall. But in between, he wrote the book I'm going to recommend, which I would just, anybody that's really interested in political history, Jim is so damn smart. And it's a book called What Was Liberalism? And it's a 400-year history of the idea of liberalism. It's not one of these books about, you know, what are the liberals doing today? It's that, but it's also written, he began to write it about liberalism and autocracy in Eastern Europe, and it expanded into the book, What Was Liberalism? So that's my 5. Am I going to get away? I'm going to, can I give you a 6th?
Absolutely.
Not on my list, but we'll say it's on my list so I can defend against because I know my granddaughter Natalie last weekend was reading a book by Colton Whitehead.
Yeah.
You know, now you're going to say, oh, he's going to recommend the Underground Railroad, but no, he wrote the Underground Railroad.
Yeah.
But Colton Whitehead is my son's classmate from Trinity High School here in New York. He's a graduate of Trinity, and I got to give Trinity a shout out. And my son's daughter Natalie was just reading this last weekend. Not reading Undergrad Railroad; she's already run that. But he's got a great novel out. She was raving about it at dinner, and commanded the whole family read it. And I can't put it on my list because I haven't read it yet, but I'm giving it a mention. It's called The Nickel Boys.
Nickel Boys, right?
But he's a big writer. So, I've tossed around in the attempt, because I know I'm recommending like these books that my children think are embarrassments. I've tossed around. I do hang out with people. Now, Colton Whitehead, I wouldn't know if I passed him, but my family does. But, James Carroll, James Travel, my friends, I can't be all dumb.
I wanted to wrap up by saying thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me. It's a privilege. And I'm grateful that I get to have these conversations. Never in a million years, when people told me, when I was thinking about starting this podcast, my girlfriend, my friends would be like, well, you never know how far it could take you. And the fact that it's taken me this far is amazing already. So I thank you. And
I want to thank you. I want to thank you for taking ideas seriously, and for a very pleasant hour and a half. It's a lot of fun this is why I have hope. You asked why I have hope. This is why I have hope. And tell your brother that he better keep making us proud. And I don't ever want him to put his graduate degree in front of his undergraduate degree.
I'll call him right after this and tell him exactly that.
All right.
So thank you very much.